The early morning mist hung low over Asheville's Blue Ridge Parkway, quiet and peaceful. That peace broke when a hiker stumbled across something out of place. Parked at a scenic overlook, teetering close to the edge of a steep drop, was a black Range Rover. Its engine was off, but the keys were still in the ignition. The hiker leaned closer, squinting into the window. Inside, on the driver's seat, was a broken phone with the screen cracked to pieces. A single shoe sat on the gravel next to the car, like someone had stepped out and never come back. The hiker stood there, frozen for a moment, unsure what to make of the scene. A chill ran down his spine as the quiet around him seemed to grow heavier. He glanced over his shoulder, scanning the area for any sign of movement. Nothing, just the faint rustle of wind through the trees. Reaching into his jacket, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. The call reached the Asheville Police Department within minutes, and it wasn't long before Detective Arthur Briggs was on his way. The seasoned investigator was only a few months away from retirement, but he wasn't the kind to coast through his final days. When the call came about an abandoned SUV at the overlook, something about the details stirred his curiosity. It was too early to tell if it was just another case of a lost hiker or something much worse. When Briggs arrived, patrol cars were already parked along the overlook, their lights flashing against the dense mist. A small group of officers stood near the Range Rover, speaking in hushed tones. Briggs stepped out of his sedan, pulling his coat tight against the chill, and approached the scene. "What do we have?" Briggs asked, his gruff voice breaking the silence. Officer Morales, a rookie with only a year on the job, gestured toward the SUV. "Vehicle's registered to Victor Gaines. No sign of him anywhere. Keys are still in the ignition, and there's this." He pointed to the shattered phone on the driver's seat. "And the shoe." Briggs frowned, crouching near the gravel to inspect the lone shoe. It was a high-end leather loafer, the kind that screamed wealth and importance. He stood, peering into the SUV's interior. The broken phone was a mess of jagged glass, as if someone had thrown it in frustration or desperation. "Did you check the surrounding area?" he asked. "Search teams are on their way," Morales replied. "But so far, nothing." Briggs nodded, his sharp eyes scanning the overlook. The steep drop beyond the guardrail made his stomach turn. If Victor had gone over, finding him would be no small task. But something about the scene didn't sit right. The car, the phone, the shoe. It all felt deliberate, like a story waiting to be unraveled. Back at the station, Briggs dug into Victor Gaines' background. The name wasn't unfamiliar. Gaines was a tech entrepreneur, the kind of man who made headlines for his ambitious projects. His latest venture, something called the Eden Array, had been making waves in the renewable energy world. A revolutionary solar system, they said. But big ideas like that always came with big enemies. Competitors, corporations, maybe even entire industries with something to lose. It didn't take long for Briggs to pull up Victor's address, a sprawling estate just outside Asheville. By the time he arrived at the property, the late afternoon sun was already sinking behind the mountains. The mansion loomed behind tall iron gates, its grandeur both impressive and intimidating. But the gates were open, and the driveway was eerily quiet. Inside, the house was pristine, every surface gleaming with the kind of perfection that spoke of wealth. That illusion shattered the moment Briggs stepped into Victor's office. The signs of a struggle were unmistakable. A chair lay overturned by the desk, and shards of glass glittered on the floor beneath a small table. A faint scent of wine lingered in the air. The desk bore a deep scratch across its surface, and papers were scattered haphazardly. Briggs's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't random. "Check the cameras," he instructed one of the officers. The mansion's state-of-the-art security system yielded footage that only deepened the mystery. The recording showed Victor entering his office the previous evening, appearing calm and composed. But after that, he wasn't seen leaving. An hour later, the camera picked up a figure slipping in through a side door. Dressed in dark clothing with their face obscured, the intruder moved swiftly and with purpose. The footage ended abruptly, leaving Briggs with more questions than answers. By the time the sun set, the pieces of the puzzle were already stacking up. Briggs returned to the station and put out calls to the people closest to Victor. First up was Evelyn Frost, Victor's longtime assistant. She arrived within the hour, her face pale and her hands fidgeting nervously. Victor's been paranoid lately, she admitted. He's been locking himself in his office, saying he needed to protect something. I thought it was just stress from the Eden Array project. Any enemies? Anyone who might want to harm him? Briggs asked. Evelyn hesitated. There's Kyle Wren, his former business partner. They had a falling out a few years ago. And his daughter, Catherine. Their relationship has always been strained, but they've been trying to reconnect. Briggs scribbled notes, his gut telling him that Evelyn was holding something back. What about the Eden Array? Could that have anything to do with this? It's possible, she said, her voice dropping. Victor always said it would change everything. He knew it was dangerous, disrupting industries like that. But I didn't think. She trailed off, her words hanging in the air. Briggs thanked her and sent her on her way, his mind already working through the angles. Victor's disappearance wasn't just a case of someone going missing. It was tangled up in something much bigger. The Eden Array, corporate sabotage, old grudges, maybe even family drama. It was a lot to sort through, but Briggs wasn't one to back down. As he sat in his car later that evening, staring out at the darkened streets of Asheville, Briggs couldn't shake the image of the cracked phone and the lone shoe. Whoever had stepped away from that Range Rover hadn't left by choice. And if Briggs knew one thing, it was this. The truth always had a way of coming out. The hiker's discovery of Victor Gaines's abandoned Range Rover had unleashed a chain of questions that refused to settle. A cracked phone on the driver's seat, a lone shoe outside on the gravel, and Victor himself, nowhere to be found. Detective Arthur Briggs wasn't the type to entertain wild theories, but as he combed through the growing web of details, it became clear this wasn't a simple case of a man walking away from his life. Victor Gaines wasn't the kind of man to vanish without cause. The tech mogul's reputation painted a picture of brilliance and ambition, an innovator who had revolutionized renewable energy. His latest venture, the Eden Array, had stirred excitement in some corners and dread in others. It was rumored to be a game-changer, a solar energy system that could upend global markets and make fossil fuels obsolete. But in an industry rife with high stakes, ambition-bred enemies, and Victor had no shortage of those. Briggs began by piecing together the relationships closest to Victor. The first thread was Evelyn Frost, his assistant, who had managed nearly every detail of Victor's professional and personal life for years. She arrived at the Asheville Police Department visibly shaken. Her usual polished demeanor was gone, replaced by someone on edge, clutching her bag like a lifeline. Evelyn explained how Victor had become increasingly secretive in recent months, working long nights and isolating himself in his office. He had confided vague fears about protecting the Eden Array, but had offered no specifics. He said people would try to stop him, she murmured. But I thought he was just being paranoid. When pressed, Evelyn pointed to two names that stood out in Victor's tangled past. Kyle Wren, a former business partner who had left under acrimonious circumstances, and Catherine Gaines, Victor's estranged daughter who had only recently re-entered his life. Evelyn claimed not to know much about their recent interactions, but her unease was telling. Briggs jotted their names in his notebook, the pieces beginning to align. Kyle Wren had once been Victor's equal, a co-founder of their first company and a man with as much vision as Victor himself. But their partnership ended in a bitter falling out, with Kyle accusing Victor of betrayal and theft. Now, years later, Kyle worked out of a small, cluttered office downtown, a shadow of the man he had once been. When Briggs met him, Kyle's bitterness was palpable. He made no effort to hide his contempt for Victor, dismissing the Eden Array as another one of Victor's pipe dreams. Still, Kyle denied having any involvement in Victor's disappearance. Look, Kyle said, leaning back in his chair. Victor screwed me over, ruined my career. But I'm not the type to waste my life chasing revenge. If anything, he made his own bed. Briggs wasn't convinced. Kyle's tone carried the resentment of someone who had spent years nursing a grudge. Still, his alibi for the night of Victor's disappearance, a neighbor who had joined him to watch a basketball game, held up. The timeline didn't quite clear Kyle entirely, but it was enough to push Briggs to consider other suspects. Before Briggs left, Kyle offered one more name, Gabriel Ortiz. The mention came offhandedly, but it struck a chord. Ortiz was one of the biggest names in renewable energy, a man whose reputation for cutthroat tactics preceded him. Victor underestimated him, Cal warned. If anyone wanted him gone, it's Ortiz. Next, Briggs turned his attention to Catherine Gaines. Victor's daughter had spent most of her life estranged from her father, harboring resentment for his absence during her childhood. But recent events suggested an attempt at reconciliation. When Briggs arrived at her apartment, Catherine's guarded expression spoke volumes. She admitted that her relationship with her father had always been strained. Growing up, Victor had been more invested in his work than his family, and by the time he reached out to repair their relationship, Catherine had learned to live without him. "He invited me over for dinner a week ago," she said, her voice distant. It felt like he was trying to make things right, but it wasn't enough. It's hard to rebuild trust after years of nothing. Still, Catherine had noticed something unusual about Victor during their last meeting. He had seemed jumpy, constantly checking his phone and glancing at the windows. When pressed, Victor had brushed off her concerns, saying only that he was under a lot of pressure. Briggs studied Catherine carefully. She was composed, but her body language suggested she was holding something back. Whether it was resentment or fear, Briggs couldn't tell. What was clear, however, was that Victor's paranoia hadn't been imagined. He'd been carrying the weight of something serious, something dangerous. The most alarming lead came when Briggs dug deeper into the Eden Array itself. A forensic team combing through Victor's mansion had discovered a blueprint for the project, along with a handwritten list of names. At the top of the list was Gabriel Ortiz. Ortiz was no stranger to controversy. As the CEO of Horizon Dynamics, a major player in the energy sector, he had been at the center of numerous lawsuits and allegations of sabotage against competitors. His reputation as a ruthless businessman made him an obvious suspect, and the connection to Victor's disappearance felt too significant to ignore. Briggs reached out to Ortiz's office, but the energy tycoon refused to meet in person, instead issuing a dismissive statement through his lawyers. Ortiz claimed no knowledge of Victor's whereabouts and dismissed any suggestion that he had reason to harm him. But something about the response felt too clean. Ortiz's history suggested a man who wouldn't hesitate to protect his empire, no matter the cost. Briggs couldn't shake the feeling that Ortiz knew more than he was letting on. As the investigation deepened, so did the complexity of Victor's inner circle. Evelyn Frost's loyalty came under scrutiny when an analysis of Victor's financial records revealed a series of irregularities. Transactions linked to Evelyn suggested she had been siphoning funds from Victor's accounts, but her motives remained unclear. When confronted, Evelyn admitted to transferring money but insisted it was for the Eden Array. "Victor told me to do it," she said, her voice trembling. "He said it was the only way to protect the project." Whether she was lying or telling the truth, Briggs couldn't be sure. But it was becoming evident that the Eden Array wasn't just a technological breakthrough. It was a source of leverage, power, and danger. With each new piece of information, the list of suspects grew more tangled. Kyle Wren, Catherine Gaines, Evelyn Frost, and Gabriel Ortiz all had their reasons to resent Victor, and all had potential motives to make him disappear. But the question remained, where was Victor now? The answer came in the form of an unexpected discovery. During a final sweep of Victor's abandoned Range Rover, investigators uncovered a hidden compartment in the vehicle. Inside was a burner phone, its contents limited to a single cryptic message, "Meet me where it all began." Briggs stared at the screen, the words pressing into his thoughts like a puzzle begging to be solved. He knew this was the breakthrough he needed. But he also knew that wherever this trail led, it wasn't going to end cleanly. Victor Gaines's life had been a mix of brilliance and ambition, but it was clear now that his disappearance wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a battle over power, trust, and betrayal. And Briggs was determined to uncover the truth, no matter where it took him. The pieces were in motion, the players circling the board. All that was left was to see how the game would end. Detective Arthur Briggs sat in his office, a stack of documents spread out before him, each page more baffling than the last. The deeper he dug into Victor Gaines's life, the more intricate the web of intrigue became. At the center of it all was the Eden Array, a revolutionary solar energy system that, if successful, could shift the balance of global energy markets. Victor had called it the future, but its potential to render fossil fuels obsolete had also made it a lightning rod for powerful enemies. The Eden Array was more than just a technological innovation. It was a declaration of war on entrenched energy giants and the vast empires they controlled. The schematics, discovered among Victor's belongings, depicted an elegant and efficient system capable of providing affordable renewable energy to entire cities. If implemented, it would upend the energy sector overnight. Fossil fuel companies, investors, and even governments stood to lose billions. Briggs quickly realized that this wasn't just a missing person case anymore. It was a battle over power, control, and money on a global scale. One name stood out in connection with Victor's disappearance: Gabriel Ortiz. As the CEO of Horizon Dynamics, one of the largest fossil fuel conglomerates in the world, Ortiz had a reputation for crushing anyone who threatened his dominance. Lawsuits, buyouts, smear campaigns. Ortiz played dirty and didn't apologize for it. Victor Gaines's Eden Array was the ultimate threat to his empire, and Briggs couldn't ignore the possibility that Ortiz had a hand in Victor's sudden disappearance. Briggs arranged a meeting with Ortiz, knowing it would be a delicate interaction. Ortiz agreed to the meeting but insisted it be held at his sprawling headquarters in Charlotte, North Carolina, a gleaming skyscraper that symbolized his influence. Ortiz greeted Briggs with a practiced smile, his polished demeanor making him hard to read. "Detective," he said smoothly, gesturing to an opulent conference room, "I assume you're here about Victor Gaines." Briggs didn't waste time. "I've heard the Eden Array would be bad news for you. Victor's disappearance doesn't look good for someone with your track record." Ortiz chuckled, his amusement almost genuine. "You think I had something to do with Victor's disappearance? Detective, I don't need to kidnap anyone. Competition is healthy, even for someone like me." Briggs leaned forward, his tone sharp. "But you don't play fair. Gaines threatened your empire. You're telling me you didn't make a move to shut him down?" Ortiz's smile faded, and his voice dropped a note. "Victor underestimated the cost of change," he said cryptically. "He thought he could reshape the world without making enemies. That kind of naivety doesn't end well." The meeting ended with no solid evidence, but Ortiz's words lingered. The CEO didn't outright deny involvement, but he hadn't admitted to anything either. Briggs left Horizon Dynamics with a sense of unease. Ortiz was a man who didn't bluff. Briggs turned his attention to Victor's personal life, hoping to understand what might have pushed the tech mogul to such extremes. He tracked down Victor's therapist, Dr. Lila Barnes, a woman whose warm demeanor belied the secrets she held. She hesitated at first, citing confidentiality, but eventually opened up enough to provide valuable insight into Victor's mental state. "Victor was troubled," she began carefully. "His work was everything to him, but it came at a cost. He believed in the Eden Array wholeheartedly, but the pressure of what it represented, what it threatened, consumed him." "What kind of pressure?" Briggs asked. Dr. Barnes folded her hands in her lap. Victor often spoke about betrayal. He was convinced that those closest to him, people he trusted, might turn on him. He didn't name names, but the paranoia was unmistakable. He told me he couldn't sleep, that he felt like he was always being watched. Briggs scribbled notes, the picture of Victor growing clearer. A brilliant man, but one crumbling under the weight of his vision and the threats it attracted. "Did he ever mention Gabriel Ortiz?" Briggs asked. Dr. Barnes hesitated. "Not by name, but he did say there were powerful forces that wanted to stop him. He believed they'd go to any lengths to keep the Eden Array from being completed." The paranoia wasn't just in Victor's head. It was real, and it was closing in on him. A forensic team was already combing through Victor's mansion for more clues. The pristine, high-tech estate seemed almost sterile, but subtle details betrayed a darker reality. In Victor's office, they found signs of a struggle: an overturned chair, a broken wine glass, and papers strewn across the floor. The most alarming discovery came from a locked drawer in Victor's desk. Inside was a small vial labeled with the name of a sedative commonly used to incapacitate someone temporarily. The vial was nearly empty, suggesting it had been used recently. "Looks like someone didn't want him putting up a fight," Briggs muttered as he studied the vial. The implication was chilling. Victor hadn't left on his own. He'd been drugged and possibly abducted. The case took a surprising turn when investigators uncovered a hidden compartment in Victor's abandoned SUV. The compartment, cleverly concealed beneath the rear cargo area, contained a burner phone. The device had only one saved message, its simplicity laced with intrigue. "Meet me where it all began." Briggs stared at the screen, the words sparking a new line of thought. Where had it all begun for Victor Gaines? His career, his ambitions, his relationships, any of these could hold the key. Briggs reviewed what he knew about Victor's early years. The tech mogul had started small, working out of a secluded lodge in the Appalachian Mountains. It was there that he developed the initial concepts for the Eden Array, surrounded by nothing but nature and his own determination. Was the lodge the place the message referred to? It was a long shot, but Briggs had nothing else to go on. As the pieces of the puzzle began falling into place, Briggs realized the case was more dangerous than he had anticipated. The Eden Array wasn't just a breakthrough in technology, it was a symbol of power that everyone wanted to control. Evelyn Frost, Kyle Wren, Catherine Gaines, and Gabriel Ortiz each had their own motives, and Victor had been caught in the crossfire of their ambition. Now, the burner phone's message hinted that Victor might still be alive. But if he was running out of time. The truth wasn't just about finding Victor anymore. It was about uncovering the full scope of the conspiracy and the lengths to which people would go to secure the Eden Array. As Briggs prepared to follow the lead to the Appalachian Lodge, he couldn't shake the feeling that the answers waiting for him there would come with consequences none of them could escape. Detective Arthur Briggs sat in his cluttered office, his desk buried beneath files, notes, and photos, all threads in the sprawling web of the Victor Gaines case. He lit his third cigarette of the morning and leaned back, scanning the names scrawled on his whiteboard. Evelyn Frost, Kyle Wren, Catherine Gaines, and Gabriel Ortiz. Each one connected to Victor, each one hiding something. The Eden Array was the common denominator, a revolutionary invention that could disrupt global energy markets, yet it had driven its creator into hiding or worse. Briggs felt the weight of the case settling heavier on his shoulders. Everyone close to Victor had a motive, and each thread he pulled seemed to unravel something darker. Evelyn Frost was where he started. The longtime assistant had been a constant in Victor's life, managing both his professional and personal affairs. But Evelyn wasn't as loyal as she appeared. Financial discrepancies in Victor's accounts had pointed to her long before she sat in the interrogation room, where she now faced Briggs. She sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her usual confidence replaced with visible tension. When Briggs asked about her connection to Gabriel Ortiz, she hesitated, her voice trembling as she began to speak. "I wasn't trying to hurt him," Evelyn said, her eyes fixed on the table. Victor was unstable. He'd grown paranoid, cutting everyone off. He wasn't listening to reason anymore. "And Ortiz?" Briggs pressed. "How does he fit into this?" Evelyn flinched. "He approached me. He said the Eden Array was too big for Victor to handle alone, that he could help protect it. I didn't know what to do. Victor was losing control, and Ortiz promised stability. Resources. Resources for you or the project?" Briggs asked sharply. Her eyes darted up, filled with guilt. "Both. I thought I could manage it, keep Ortiz from taking over completely. But Victor found out what I was doing. He said I'd betrayed him, and I did. But I never wanted him to disappear, Detective. I didn't want this." Her confession was tinged with remorse, but Briggs couldn't ignore the ambition lurking beneath her words. Evelyn had crossed a line, believing she could control a dangerous situation, and instead, she'd unleashed chaos. Next was Kyle Wren. Victor's former business partner sat across from Briggs with his arms crossed, his body language radiating defensiveness. Kyle had been an innovator alongside Victor in the early days, but their partnership had dissolved in acrimony years ago. Now, Kyle was a man bitter about his fall from grace. Briggs confronted him about his meeting with Ortiz weeks before Victor vanished. "Yeah, I met with Ortiz," Kyle said, his tone defiant. "So what? I was looking for a way to rebuild my career. Ortiz has the connections, the money. It wasn't about Victor." Briggs leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. "Then why did you discuss Victor with him? Don't lie to me, Kyle. Ortiz doesn't meet with people unless he sees an opportunity." Kyle hesitated, then sighed heavily. Fine. He wanted information about the Eden array, about Victor's state of mind. I told him some things. Nothing major, just enough to keep him interested. I didn't know he was planning something bigger. You gave him ammunition, Briggs said bluntly. Did you know what Ortiz was capable of? I didn't think it would go this far, Kyle admitted, his voice quieter now. I was angry at Victor, sure, but I wasn't trying to destroy him. I just wanted to move on with my life. Briggs studied Kyle carefully. His resentment was clear, but so was his regret. Kyle had played a dangerous game with Ortiz, and now he was paying the price for his misplaced trust. Catherine Gaines, Victor's estranged daughter, was harder to pin down. She had been distant for most of her father's life, their relationship fractured by his relentless focus on his work. Yet, Victor had reached out to her in the months leading up to his disappearance, drawing her into the vortex of his paranoia. Briggs met her at a quiet cafe, where she greeted him with a guarded demeanor, her answers clipped and calculated. My father was complicated, Catherine said. He wasn't a hero. He left my mother and me when we needed him most. For years, I didn't even know if he was alive. Then why reconnect now? Briggs asked. She paused, stirring her coffee absently. He reached out, said he wanted to fix things, but it wasn't about me. Not really. He was scared. He kept talking about people trying to take what was his, about betrayal. I think he was using me as an anchor. Did you feel used? Briggs pressed. Yes, she said simply, meeting his gaze with icy resolve. But it wasn't just that. He was trying, in his own way. I helped him with some of his work because I thought it might bring us closer. But the more time I spent with him, the more I saw. He didn't trust anyone, not even me. Catherine's bitterness was palpable, but so was her pain. Victor's attempts at reconciliation had come too late, and whatever trust they might have rebuilt had been shattered by the same paranoia that consumed the rest of his life. Briggs's investigation turned sharply when a forensic search of Victor's abandoned SUV revealed a hidden compartment beneath the driver's seat. Inside was a burner phone with a single text message sent shortly before Victor vanished. Meet me where it all began. The message was cryptic, but laden with significance. For a man like Victor, whose career had spanned decades, where it all began could have meant many places. But when Briggs cross-referenced the phone's GPS data with Victor's known history, one location stood out: a secluded lodge deep in the Appalachian Mountains. The lodge had been a sanctuary for Victor in the early days of his career, a place where he had retreated to think and create. Briggs felt the pieces clicking into place. The lodge was remote, isolated, and steeped in personal history. If Victor had gone anywhere willingly, it was there. But the lodge's significance also made it a potential trap. Whoever had sent the message knew exactly how to draw Victor out. Briggs organized a team to investigate. As they drove into the mountains, the weight of the case settled heavily on him. The lodge was more than just a location. It was the intersection of Victor's ambition and the betrayals that had fractured his world. Evelyn, Kyle, Catherine, and Ortiz had all played their parts, and now the truth was waiting for him in the Appalachian wilderness. The road leading to the lodge was winding and treacherous, flanked by dense forest on both sides. When they finally arrived, Briggs stepped out of the car and took in the sight of the building. It was rustic and weathered but sturdy, its windows darkened and its surroundings eerily quiet. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and decay. Briggs and his team approached cautiously. The door was unlocked, creaking open under the weight of Briggs's hand. Inside, the lodge was a time capsule of Victor's early days. Notes and sketches were scattered across the tables, blueprints pinned to the walls. It was clear someone had been there recently. A half-empty coffee mug sat on the counter, and footprints in the dust indicated movement through the space. Briggs's eyes fell on a table in the corner, where a stack of papers caught his attention. As he sifted through them, he recognized designs for the Eden array, more advanced than anything he had seen before. But there was something else: handwritten notes scrawled in Victor's distinct script. One in particular stood out: "Trust no one. They're closer than I thought." The message sent a chill down Briggs's spine. Victor's paranoia wasn't just fear. It had been justified. The people closest to him had betrayed him, and now the consequences of their actions were closing in. As Briggs examined the lodge further, his radio crackled to life. "Detective, you're going to want to see this," one of his team members said. He followed the voice outside, where they had discovered another clue. A trail leading away from the lodge, marked by broken branches and scattered footprints. It appeared recent, and Briggs knew it was the next step in the journey. Victor had been here, but he was still running. From whom, or to what, remained the final question. As the team prepared to follow the trail, Briggs couldn't shake the feeling that the answers waiting at the end wouldn't come without a cost. The lodge had revealed the fractures in Victor's world, but the truth would demand more. Trust, ambition, and betrayal had brought them here, and now the stakes were higher than ever. Arthur Briggs drove through the winding roads of the Appalachian Mountains, the dense forest around him swallowing the last rays of sunlight. The GPS coordinates from the burner phone had led him to this remote location, a forgotten lodge hidden deep in the wilderness. The isolation of the place set Briggs on edge. This wasn't just a hideout. It was a sanctuary for someone trying to stay invisible. Or perhaps it was a trap. The lodge came into view, its weathered wooden structure blending into the surrounding trees. There was no movement, no sign of life, but the presence of a single vehicle parked nearby suggested otherwise. Briggs stepped out of his car, his senses on high alert. He radioed the local authorities for backup, but instructed them to hold their position. He wanted to assess the situation before too many people got involved. Gun holstered but ready, Briggs approached the door cautiously. It creaked open under his touch, revealing a dimly lit interior. Dust particles floated in the air, illuminated by the fading light streaming through the windows. The lodge was rustic but not abandoned, recently used, judging by the scattered papers and an empty mug on the table. A faint sound drew his attention deeper into the building. "Victor?" Briggs called out, his voice steady. A shuffling noise came from one of the back rooms, followed by the hesitant creak of footsteps. Victor Gaines emerged, his appearance startling. The once imposing tech mogul looked frail, his clothes disheveled and his face gaunt. His eyes darted nervously around the room before settling on Briggs. "Arthur," Victor said, his voice hoarse and weak. "You found me." Briggs nodded, lowering his guard slightly. "You've got a lot of people looking for you, Victor. Care to explain why you disappeared?" Victor hesitated, his hands trembling as he gestured for Briggs to sit. He slumped into a chair across from the detective, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "They turned on me," he said finally. "Everyone I trusted. Evelyn, Kyle, even my own daughter. They were working against me. And Gabriel, he wanted everything I'd built." Briggs listened intently as Victor recounted the events that had driven him into hiding. Evelyn, his trusted assistant, had coerced him into signing over partial rights to the Eden Array, threatening to expose personal and professional secrets if he refused. She had been working with Gabriel Ortiz, feeding him information and trying to leverage Victor's creation for their own gain. "I couldn't stay," Victor said, his voice breaking. "Once I realized what they were doing, I knew they'd stop at nothing. Evelyn was desperate to control the array, and Gabriel, he's ruthless. If they'd caught me, I wouldn't have survived." Briggs leaned forward, his tone firm. "Why didn't you go to the police? Why run?" Victor's eyes darkened. "Because I didn't know who to trust. They were everywhere, watching everything. I had to disappear to figure out who was behind it all. And now I know." Victor's frailty masked a simmering resolve, but Briggs could see he was at his breaking point. The detective realized they needed to confront the others to untangle the full story. He devised a plan to bring the key players to the lodge, using Victor's survival as bait. Over the next day, Briggs reached out to Evelyn Frost, Kyle Wren, and Catherine Gaines, summoning them to the lodge under the pretense of resolving Victor's disappearance. He carefully withheld the fact that Victor was alive, knowing their reactions would reveal more than their words. When Evelyn arrived, she was visibly on edge, her polished composure cracking. Kyle followed shortly after, his usual arrogance tempered by suspicion. Catherine arrived last, her expression unreadable as she surveyed the surroundings. None of them expected to see Victor alive, and when he stepped into the room, the tension became palpable. Victor stood at the center of the room, leaning heavily on the table for support but holding his ground. "You all thought I was gone," he said, his voice sharp despite his weakened state. "But I've been watching, waiting. And now it's time to face what you've done." Evelyn was the first to react, her face pale. "Victor, she began, but he cut her off. "Don't," he snapped. "You don't get to explain, not yet." He turned to Kyle, his gaze piercing. "And you. I trusted you once, but you've done nothing but undermine me at every turn. You think I don't know about your meeting with Gabriel? About the information you fed him?" Kyle's jaw tightened, and he opened his mouth to protest, but Victor silenced him with a raised hand. "Save it. You're all complicit in this mess. Every single one of you." Catherine stood apart from the others, her arms crossed tightly, her face a mask of detachment. When Victor addressed her, his tone softened slightly. "And you, Catherine, I thought reconnecting with you would fix something, would give me a reason to trust again. But you stayed silent while they turned against me. You let this happen." Catherine's eyes narrowed. "You don't get to pin this on me, Dad," she said coolly. "You pushed everyone away, made it impossible for anyone to reach you. Don't act like you're blameless." The room descended into a heated exchange as Victor, Evelyn, Kyle, and Catherine aired years of grievances and accusations. Briggs let them vent, watching carefully, piecing together the dynamics. He could see the cracks forming, Evelyn's desperation to justify her actions, Kyle's bitterness, Catherine's quiet fury. But before Briggs could step in to mediate, the door to the lodge burst open. Gabriel Ortiz strode in, flanked by two imposing associates. His presence sent a chill through the room, his cold, calculated demeanor dominating the space. "Well," Gabriel said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "isn't this a touching little reunion? Victor, you've caused me quite a bit of trouble. And Evelyn, you've been disappointing, to say the least." Victor straightened, his voice defiant. "Get out, Gabriel. You're not getting the Eden array." Gabriel smirked, his eyes narrowing. "Oh, Victor, you still think you're in control, but you're not." Evelyn lost her nerve. Kyle was useless, and Catherine, well, she's the only one here I might still have a use for. Catherine's expression didn't change, but Briggs noticed a subtle shift in her posture, her hands slipping into her coat pockets. Gabriel advanced toward Victor, his tone turning menacing. "The schematics, Victor. Hand them over, or I'll take them myself." Briggs stepped forward, his hand ready for anything. "Gabriel, this ends now. We've got enough evidence to tie you to Victor's disappearance and your attempts to sabotage the Eden array. Stand down." Gabriel ignored him, his focus locked on Victor. "You'll destroy everything this was meant to be," Victor said, his voice rising. Gabriel sneered. "You're naive. Progress comes at a cost, Victor. And you've underestimated me for the last time." Gabriel Ortiz's demands hung heavily in the lodge as he stood over Victor Gaines. The schematics for the Eden array were still out of reach, sitting untouched on the table, and Victor remained silent, his expression one of exhaustion. Gabriel's tone was firm, but it carried a quiet, undeniable menace, one that had silenced everyone else in the room. Evelyn Frost stayed by the wall, her arms crossed as she shifted uneasily, her usually composed demeanor cracking. Kyle Wren was fidgeting in a corner, muttering under his breath about how this wasn't what he'd signed up for, but he made no move to leave. Catherine Gaines, Victor's daughter, sat apart from the group, her gaze fixed intently on Gabriel, her expression unreadable. Arthur Briggs watched it all from the door, his instincts sharper than ever. Years as a detective had taught him to recognize the moments right before things spiraled out of control, and this was one of them. The room felt like a loaded spring, and it was only a matter of time before it snapped. Gabriel took another step toward Victor, his presence growing more threatening with every move. His voice was quieter now, but the weight of his words carried through the room. Evelyn opened her mouth to interject, but Gabriel shot her a look that froze her in place. Kyle shifted in his seat, but Arthur noticed it wasn't to help, it was to edge closer to the exit. He was ready to bolt if things got worse. Catherine, however, didn't move. She stayed perfectly still, watching Gabriel. It was as though she was waiting for something, though Arthur couldn't tell what. She hadn't spoken a word since Gabriel arrived, and her silence unnerved him. Then, suddenly, Catherine stood. The movement was abrupt, breaking the tension in the room like a knife through fabric. She stepped forward, placing herself between Gabriel and Victor, her actions deliberate. Arthur caught the shift in her posture, the slight tremble in her hands as she reached into her coat. Gabriel stepped back, his confident smirk fading as he realized what was happening. The sharp sound that followed was unmistakable, reverberating through the lodge and leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Gabriel stumbled, his eyes wide as he clutched his side. He collapsed moments later, his movements slowing until they stopped entirely. Catherine set the object she had drawn on the table, her expression blank as she stepped back. The silence was deafening as everyone processed what had just happened. Evelyn's face was pale, her eyes darting from Gabriel to Catherine. Kyle sank into his chair, his hands covering his mouth. Victor didn't move, his gaze locked on his daughter. Arthur took control of the situation immediately, his years of experience guiding his movements. He retrieved the item from the table and secured it, his focus shifting quickly to Gabriel. A glance was all it took to confirm what Arthur already suspected. There was nothing anyone could do for him now. Arthur's voice was calm but firm as he called for backup. He kept the others in place, ensuring no one left the room before officers arrived. Catherine stood where she was, silent and unmoving, while Evelyn backed into the corner, muttering something to herself about how this wasn't supposed to happen. When law enforcement arrived, they worked swiftly to secure the lodge. Catherine didn't resist as she was led out, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't say a word, her expression calm but distant. Evelyn was questioned immediately, her earlier confidence replaced by visible unease. Kyle sat quietly, avoiding eye contact as he gave his statement. Arthur remained inside, overseeing the scene as officers moved around him. Something about the night didn't sit right with him. Catherine's actions had been decisive, almost too much so. It was as though she'd been waiting for this exact moment. The pieces didn't quite fit, and Arthur couldn't let it go. As the lodge cleared, Arthur approached Evelyn. She was standing near the window, her arms crossed as she watched the scene below. Arthur's instincts told him she wasn't as shaken as she appeared. "You knew this was going to happen," Arthur said, keeping his voice low. Evelyn didn't turn around. "You're imagining things, detective." Arthur stepped closer, his tone sharpening. "You knew Gabriel was a liability, and you used Catherine to handle it. You manipulated her." Evelyn turned then, her expression calm but her eyes cold. "Gabriel was reckless," she said simply. "He would have destroyed everything Victor built. Someone had to act, and Catherine was perfect. She had the motive, the opportunity, and the desperation to make it work. All I had to do was give her the right nudge." Arthur felt his chest tighten as the truth of her words sank in. Evelyn had orchestrated the entire night, pulling strings from the shadows to remove Gabriel without implicating herself. Catherine had been her pawn, and Gabriel's incident had been the result of calculated manipulation. Arthur's voice was cold as he spoke. "You played her. You played everyone in this room." Evelyn shrugged, her composure unshaken. "And now the problem is solved. The Eden array is safe, and Gabriel isn't around to ruin it. Sometimes you have to make hard decisions, detective. I thought you'd understand that." Arthur stared at her, his fists clenched at his sides, but he knew there was nothing more he could do. At least not yet. Evelyn had covered her tracks too well, leaving nothing that could directly tie her to what had happened. Victor remained inside the lodge as the others were taken away. He sat at the table, the Eden array schematics still spread out in front of him. His hands trembled as he gathered the pages, stacking them neatly before placing them in a plain box. He locked the box in the drawer of the desk and poured himself a drink, staring out the window into the fading darkness. The events of the night had taken everything from him, and he knew he couldn't hold on to the project any longer. Arthur lingered outside, watching as dawn broke over the mountains. The crisp morning air carried a weight that felt almost suffocating. He glanced back at the lodge one last time before heading to his car, his thoughts swirling. The truth of what had happened was clear, but the deeper betrayals would linger long after the sun rose over the clearing. He started the engine, leaving the lodge behind and knowing the case was far from over. Some questions had been answered, but others remained buried in the mountain mist, waiting to resurface in time.